Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Inside an Explorer's Arctic Journal, Episode 3. Thank you to all of you who've tuned in to Episodes 1 and 2. Congratulations to the winners of the Adventure Canada voucher and to the winners in Episode 2 of the 2 advance reader copies of Ice Walker. I hope you got them in the mail okay. Here we go. On to Episode 3. The idea of North. You can't really think about the North nowadays without the bombardment of information we're getting about anthropogenic climate change. These are the hottest days ever in the North, where change is probably happening at an accelerated rate, maybe 2 times more quickly than elsewhere. And that has huge implications not only for the 2-legged and 4-legged dwellers of the North, but also for the rest of us. And so before we go anywhere, I think we have to acknowledge that North is a thermostat and we'd better be paying attention to it. And or North is canary, maybe even furry 4-legged canary. We need the North. We are all Northern people, and this idea of North is a bit of a historical look and really just a discussion generator, but the North is something, it's a fact of our lives regardless of where we live. But to get started, I want to just establish that there are a bunch of different Norths that you may have heard about. Geographic North at the North Pole, that point around which the Earth rotates. The other end of the Earth is the South Pole, of course, 90 degrees north latitude. There's also magnetic north, which is a different north that is created by the lines of or magnetic field around the Earth caused by the planetary features of the Earth. And it's actually in a different place than the geographic North Pole. And the difference between the two is often referred to as not often, it is called declination. And if you happen to live on a line that joins the 2 poles where magnetic north and geographic north are in the same direction, that's the line of 0 declination, yeah, you'd be around Winnipeg. But beyond that, you've got to make adjustments. But map makers talk about grid north, which is a north that, a different north that exists in the process of taking a spherical surface and putting it onto a flat sheet. And then, of course, there's true north and due north and moral north and ethical north and Christopher Norment's The North of Our Lives. Christopher Norment, who's a wonderful writer, was one of the poor adventurers who looked all over the world for a place to go to have a winter of solitude and interaction with wild nature in the 70s, and he chose his group chose the Thalon Game Sanctuary, and they were the poor souls on whom Cosmos 954, the errant Russian satellite, landed. And these guys who were wanting to have a wilderness experience found themselves in the midst of a platoon of flown in, Operation Morning Light to clean up the satellite. They found themselves going from their pristine little cabin on the shores of the Thalon River, getting whisked down to Edmonton to be decontaminated for possible radioactive poisoning. Whole bunch of Norths. Christopher Norment's North. Where the big lad in the red suit hangs out, not entirely sure. But for the purposes of this presentation, what I would like to do is really just make a distinction between North a direction and North an idea, and call North an idea more like a proper noun. And my sense of the idea of North as something other than a direction, as a kind of a suite of perspectives, came in about 1967. I was a teenager, and CBC Radio, to which I listened under the blankets as an avid fan of Theatre 1030 and Ideas, and anyway, it was on there. I heard Glenn Gould ostensibly getting on the train from Winnipeg to Churchill and talking to 5 characters on the train about what it means to be North. And I just want to play you a little bit of that because it astounds me now. Although it was fascinating, and although I mean, it made what was later called contrapuntal radio. Gould is the musician, of course, and the way that he laid down these 4 studio interviews, one on top of the other, as if he were recording and composing music. He laid that on the bed of the train, and it made a compelling and very different radio documentary. It was actually, I didn't even know this, I have it on a 33 1/3 record, but CBC at the time made a 16mm film of the same program, and I just want to give you a taste of the program here in the bit of the film that was created for that. What astounds me about that is that all of the people who contributed to it were white Southerners, and secondly, it's as if the North was this kind of unpeopled place. And you don't hear any Indigenous voices. Times have changed since 1967, since the centennial. But also, what has changed is our idea of North. And my goodness, there are all kinds of connotations now. The biggest brand around, North Face, the Raptors, We the North. There's a video game with buxom women and bears breaking their chains. It's called The Idea of North, of course, other Norths. But to take it all the way to the to the sublime, from well, to show you the spectrum, it turns out there's a very fine a cappella ensemble, musical ensemble, called The Idea of North. And in their album Live at Lunch, they perform a song that I just want to play a little bit for you because I'd like to dedicate this to the erstwhile leader of the free world, Donald Trump. A little bit of the idea of North, musically speaking. Oh, enough of that. Why do we think about the North the way we do? Well, we're a product of our environment, and for many of us, the environment, particularly in school, involved these big flat square maps, Mercator projections that often leave off the top and bottom 20 degrees because there's so much distortion on those maps, making us think of maybe the North, maybe not thinking of the North at all, but certainly something you could leave out and wasn't all that important anyway. Nobody particularily's house was on it, at least not so you'd know in grade school. And it's no secret that my favorite map of the North is a circumpolar projection with the North Pole in the middle instead of sort of splayed out at the ends, if it's there at all. That shows the relationships and the adjacencies of the 8 circumpolar countries and what's going on there. But yeah, so that, I mean, school has shaped us in a very particular way. And of course, our cosmology, our mythology has shaped it as well. And I talked about this in episode 2. I mean, when we see the northern sky, Polaris, the pole star, is the tail of the Little Dipper, Ursa Minor, the little bear. And of course, the Big Dipper is Ursa Major. And Arctic is from Arcticos, Greek word meaning home of a bear. And yeah, and back in the day when sailors were sailing, it was almost a mythological concept. This Ultima Thule was as far north as it was possible to get in a sailing vessel, and that's kind of lived on in the literature of exploration. And even the early cartographers had, well-informed but sometimes fanciful notions. Here's a map that posits that there's open water at the North Pole. And that is written into kind of the intellectual DNA of those of us who were schooled in the Western tradition, along with terms like terra nullius, for the North, there's nothing there, terra incognito, we have no idea what's there. Jacques Cartier looked at the north shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and this has often been applied to lands further afield, northward, the land God gave to Cain, kind of the leftover land. And of course, anywhere beyond the tree line is often referred to as the barren lands, and it's anything but. But I have to say that my entry into the North with Glenn Gould and others, but also reading the journals of John Franklin and Charles Francis Hall, and a lot of the people who spent a lot of time looking for the Northwest Passage, Jules Verne's Englishman at the North Pole, fascinating stories, but they led me to kind of imagine myself in an unpeopled wilderness. And that unpeopled wilderness wasn't completely unpeopled, because when there were Inuit there in the historic period, often who were packed up and taken home and died of terrible vectors of disease brought to them by their exploration captors. And those stories didn't really do anything to dispel the notion that, well, it's mostly this terra incognita. But as we have looked north and grown in our understanding of the world, particularly in the last 100 years or so, the North as larder, the North as sacred space, the North as an energy source, the North as a homeland, as a passage, all of those different Norths now feed into the idea of North. Wally McLean in Gould's piece posited that, suggested that further to William James' notion that we needed the moral equivalent of war that made men strong and built strong character. We needed something to be against, and he suggested that the North was something that we could chafe against that would bring the best out of people. I'm not sure that it does, but when we really started paying attention to the North was when we realized there were, besides the passage fascination in the 19th century and earlier, the idea that there was energy there for us to use, sort of North as gas station, that really focused our attentions. But it also allowed us to meet the Northerners. And the person in my life, and perhaps in yours too, who helped do that was Justice Thomas Berger, who was charged with the responsibility of exploring the notion of putting a big gas pipeline or a hydrocarbon oil and gas pipeline down the Mackenzie, up the Mackenzie Valley from the Beaufort Sea. And Berger did something that had not happened before that. He said, gee whiz, if we're going to, sounds like a hillbilly. He's not he's a wonderfully dignified and very clever man, who I'm so glad to have met when I was at university in the 70s, and when he was touring with Northern Frontier, Northern Homeland. But he suggested that if you want to put a pipeline in a remote place like the Mackenzie Valley, you should probably talk to the people who live there. And so he, not single-handedly, but he had hearings up and down the Mackenzie Valley, producing the most remarkable record of passion and connection to place and homeland, and the interconnections of the old world and the new, tradition and development in the most appropriate voices, the voices of the people who live there. And his final report, Northern Frontier, Northern Homeland, and the record in any library of this, in the repository libraries of all of the transcripts, is a truly remarkable body of scholarship, a truly remarkable portrait of the North, but also of human enterprise. Northern Frontier, Northern Homeland, in a lot of, the voices of those Northerners was sufficiently compelling for Berger to suggest to the government of the day a 10-year moratorium on that pipeline. And that big pipeline has never been built. There are other pipelines, and of course our perspective on oil and gas is shifting slowly. But the notion of Northern Homeland, I think, was somehow fell away. But it was based on Berger's work that when we started looking seriously at other energy possibilities, other mineral possibilities in the North, and it wasn't just the Canadians, we started to pay attention to a space that was no longer kind of crown land or anything goes for the, I mean, in Alaska, for example, were it not for the building of the Alaska pipeline, which catalyzed the negotiations with all of the Alaskan First Nations to create almost a comprehensive land claim, well, it wasn't almost, it was a comprehensive land claim agreement that set up regional corporations, and there was a transfer of funds and so on. Whether it was fair is a whole other matter. But that process of energy that took us into the North with intention to remove resources, but also allowed us to grow an obligation or a sense of obligation to the people who live there. And that process has fundamentally, North as energy source has shifted to North as homeland, and it's changed the map of Canada. You know, Inuit Nunangat is all of the Inuit in 4 main regions across the country, from the Nunavut way up in the west to Nunatsiavut in Labrador, Nunavik in northern Quebec, and of course Nunavut. And of course on July 9th, just a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago, we celebrated Nunavut Day, and that's a huge, huge thing for the people who live there, but it's a huge achievement for Canada. It's a very difficult thing to undertake, but Northerners are up for it. And I look at this picture, I mean, it's 10 years ago now. That's a Nunavut Day parade in Kuluktuk. I just arrived in town with the first youth from that community who arrived in the community by canoe. We'd organized by Angalalek Peterson, who was a kid from there. Got a whole bunch of northern and southern kids together and organized this trip, and we ended up in Kuluktuk on the Coronation Gulf on Nunavut Day, and it's a happy, happy day. But as the notion of homeland is growing, North as homeland, so too are the voices of the Northerners. And there are there are Northerners involved in policy. There should be more. There are more Northerners involved in government. There should be more. But it's happening, and education is happening. Elders like Mary Simon are pushing for education, and many, many different Northerners are insistent that language be protected, that language be written into government, and so on and so on. But there are others there as well, like Alatuk Aipali, who sadly died, but who was a very, very clever social commentarian, a cartoonist, if you like, but an artist as well. And something that he said before he died, I think is worth mentioning, because it was, he said, "Let us put without hesitation a voice in the mouth of our silent mind." That's a direct reference, I think, to Glenn Gould and the idea of North without any Northerners in it. You know, since we last were together, my wife and I, Gail, had our 40th anniversary, and over those 4 decades, we have either together or singly spent part of every year in the North. And the changes that we have seen in that time, in some cases, are dramatic as anything, particularly the summer minimums of ice. Boy, you know, back in the 1970s, when I was doing my bear work at the University of Guelph, the thought of, I don't know, sailing through Prince of Wales Strait between Banks Island and Victoria Island, the thought of swimming in Prince of Wales Strait, completely off the cards. No way. But that is, and has been for a number of years, open for business in the summer. And, you know, even as soon or as late ago as 1969, when the Manhattan looked to go through the Northwest Passage as a sort of demonstration that shipping was possible, they attempted to go up through McClure Strait, which is above Banks Island, and that was choked with ice in 1969, but they ended up going up through Prince of Wales Strait. But it was frozen. It's not anymore. And I just want to highlight the Manhattan. I don't want to highlight the Manhattan so much as I want to highlight the fact that there was a Canadian icebreaker called the Johnny MacDonald that really made it possible for that. The tanker was adapted for ice. It had a new bow on it, and it was full of, I think, probably bilge water or ballast. It had one token barrel of oil on the deck that was this kind of a symbolic gesture. But the MacDonald, the Canadian Coast Guard, helped it happen. But there was a moment that doesn't get as much attention as it should. Inuit hunters took themselves out into the front of stopped the Manhattan on its trail through the Northwest Passage and said, hey, you know, you should this is our homeland. You should ask for permission, which the captain did, and it was given by the hunters and so on. But it was a highly symbolic and very important gesture. And it's actually, as conversations about sovereignty and particularly northern boundaries and that sort of thing, and I really don't want to get into that, although this is a wonderful topic for discussion on the ship with some of the true experts we have on policy and politics. That notion that the people who live in the north of Canada, the Inuit, are not just, I mean, they were nomadic, but the land is not, the land-water interface is not the edge of their territory, as it were. They live and work the ice as well, which makes the waterways highly significant range or territory for people who are the Canadians living in the north. So that was a symbolic gesture in 1969. Another significant and symbolic, but also practical, functional gesture was when the Nordic Orion, a big bulk carrier, like an open-going, ocean-going, big bulk carrier, went through the Northwest Passage in, when was it? Not 20, well, we can look it up. Maybe 4 years ago. But that was very significant. It took a load of coal from Vancouver to Pori, Finland, stopping in Nuuk. It went from west to east and saved a lot of money, saved a lot of fuel, saved a lot of sailors' hourly wages, and in fact was able to load on 15,000 metric tons more coal because the water through the Northwest Passage, the route is shorter, but the water is deeper than the Panama Canal, where it would have had to go with that same load. There aren't ore carriers moving through the Northwest Passage by the dozen or anything like it at the moment, but I think it's significant that we, get ready for that. I can't really think of Northwest Passage without thinking of my friend and canoeing buddy David Hadfield, who's a singer-songwriter, but in his real job, day job, he was a pilot for Air Canada, a captain who flew from Toronto to Beijing for the last years of his working career. And for any of you who've flown those big circle routes, you'll see the maps here. That's a route from, I don't know what the date was, but it was a flight from Toronto to Beijing, of course, that goes right over the pole. And this was presciently predicted, if you like, the North as crossroads of the world by one of the leaders of the Canadian Arctic expedition in the years leading up to World War I. Villemar Stephenson said, you know, people are going to meet here, and he was talking about air travel as well. Back then, but he was also thinking about or portending, I guess, what would come. And indeed, the Northwest Passage is very much a real idea at this point, and it's of interest to many countries that don't have any Arctic coastline, like China and Taiwan and India, who want to get their manufactured goods to market. And there's a lot to be said about that. Some of the main distinctions, there's the Northwest Passage with several routes in Canada. In that green line that you can see, McClure Strait is presented. It's almost a straight line through, if you drop down around Cambridge Bay and into the Coronation Gulf and around that way through Simpson Strait or through Peel Sound. Sorry about that. I promised not to throw a whole bunch of names around. But anyway, if you go the convoluted route through the Northwest Passage, it has some implications. But the Northeast Passage, or the Northern Sea Route, has had tons of cargo, thousands, millions of tons of cargo moving back and forth, fuel and commodities. And of course, this is of great interest to the people who are shipping. And at the moment, in our Northwest Passage, there is not, I mean, it says bulk carrier, I think 0.003% in that year. That was the Nordic Orion. There's a little bit of bulk. But most of the shipping at the moment is shipping community resupply, passenger ships like the Ocean Endeavour. But what has sort of signaled the change in the Northwest Passage is of the arrival of ships like the Crystal Serenity, which is a big cruise ship, and it has done the Northwest Passage back and forth a number of different times. And in fact, the Crystal Company is running and offering very expensive but fascinating tours in the Northern Sea Route as well. And you wonder why Adventure Canada, or an agent of theirs, which is James Raffan, is talking about the Crystal Serenity. I want to just say that one of the things I like a lot about Adventure Canada is it's not, and the Ocean Endeavour is it's not the Crystal Serenity. And some of the key differences, instead of 1,500 bodies in the cabins above, we've got 200. We've got an amazing staff of 30 people plus 130 crew on the ship. But it's a shallow draft ship that's very stable. It's ice hardened, so it can go almost anywhere. It's got stabilizers and bow thrusters. It's very maneuverable. It's got 20 Zodiacs, so you can get off the ship at a moment's notice. You don't need to lower a tender and have a jetty at the other side to land. But I think the size of the operation with Adventure Canada is also dictated by the Swan family, who run it as a family business. And you can bet that, well, they've made partnerships and they've made it their business to connect into the communities they visit. And they hire staff from those communities. And it doesn't matter whether you're in the Faroe Islands or Greenland or in the archipelago of Nunavut, you can be pretty sure that the first person off the Adventure Canada ship into a community will probably be somebody from that community who's been hired on as a staff, and will be able to greet the community leaders in their own language, which in many cases is not English. And I absolutely love that about Adventure Canada, and I really believe that that is the way to have a transformative experience, as opposed to a really lovely series of venues to have fancy drinks and lovely meals as you cruise through somebody else's backyard. North of strategic space, brought clear to me by my dad, who was a surgeon lieutenant in the Royal Navy, but he served on a destroyer called HMS Farndale as a support vessel, as an escort on the Murmansk run. And this was Murmansk in the northwest and on the Kola Peninsula of Russia. It was the only 24 or round the clock, round the calendar open port. And this was the Allies supplying the Russian side with the needed materials to fight the Axis fighters, the Nazis. And I had the most, 10 years ago, Gail and I were having our 30th anniversary, and we, at the invitation of then Canadian Ambassador John Sloan, went to Murmansk, and we were part of a group of Canadians honoring the brave men and women who fought on the Murmansk run to make that strategic space, to support that strategic space. And it was a great honor for me as the son of a British sailor to be asked to present flowers to the flower person to some of my dad's cronies or contemporaries in the Russian Navy. It was very much a highlight, but really does, I mean, the tension between the West and the East is not, well, it's gone up and down. It seems to be going up again. But of course, what was a frozen wasteland, or an untravelable wasteland, except unless you were Inuit with dogs or snowmobiles or what have you, is now melting. And the idea that this would be a workable theater for conflict is very much alive and well. So if you want to be a player in that world, you need to have shipping. For better or for worse, that is Canada's oldest, and well, it's not the oldest, it's the oldest one on the water, I think. It's called the Louis S. Saint Laurent. It's the flagship of our ice-breaking fleet, but she's really old and can't go to the north in the winter. The Russians, by contrast, have big nuclear-powered icebreakers that can push through anything, anytime. And of course, both of our friends and allies and potential enemies have submarines who have been traveling with impunity in the Northwest Passage probably far longer than anybody wants to admit. And of course our politicians, one time kind or another, have asserted the Canadian presence in the North and in various ways, and have in many cases been lampooned for it, perhaps deservedly so. And it doesn't matter what your political stripe is. I mean, the Graham Mackay, I love his work. He's equal opportunity teaser of Canada's interest in the North. I mean, let's face it, we are so incredibly out-icebreakered by, well, Russia for sure, but I mean, some summers recently, China's got more functioning horsepower for icebreakers on the water than we do. And China, with its vast Arctic coastline, whoops, it doesn't have one, but it does have an interest. And you remember the ice save crisis in Iceland back in 2008? Guess who bought Icelandic currency at half the value and helped prop up the economy? Well, that was China, and they're very interested in the port potential of Iceland and as a way of getting their televisions and bicycles and all the things that are made to market. And of course there are people who've played around with the North as strategic space, not least Artur Chillingatov, who is a swashbuckling Russian man of science, who famously planted a flag, the Russian flag, at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean at the North Pole. And I got a chance to meet Dr. Chillingatov at a function in Moscow a few years back, and I said, "Oh boy, you set the cat amongst the pigeons when you did that," and he just laughed. And I think because he knew that the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is a collaboratively created document with signatories just of every significant nation, that establishes the ground rules, if you like, of use of the sea, that is establishing not only the borderlines by technical means, but also the dispute mechanisms. So there are issues about sovereignty, but they're certainly not big ones, and they're not at the top of the agenda. There's far more important activity going on, particularly with the North as a larder or preparer of or provider of raw materials. And so there's a gold mine at Kupol, which is above the Arctic Circle in Siberia. And you may remember back in the 70s, Chuck Fipke's great find and the great diamond hunt in the Northwest Territories, which has created big diamond mines that are actually flailing at the moment in COVID times. But 30% of the undiscovered oil and gas, and that's a reliable number, I believe, with an algorithm that's created on the best geological data available, geotechnical data. I mean, there's a little bit of fancy fictional writing in it, but there's a lot of resource. There's oil and gas, there are heavy metals, there's iron, and iron ore in particular. Some of the richest iron ore in the world is in the north end of Baffin, a huge supply of that was at Mary River, where a Canadian company, Baffinland Mining, has established a mine. And that ore is, I mean, their equipment has come through the Northwest Passage from Asia. They're actively moving ore, but they're moving it east as much as west into Europe as opposed to Asia. But Baffinland too is having its troubles in COVID and with the market as it is. But that ore is so rich that in Europe, for example, when people are very interested in the absolute cradle-to-grave energy cost of a manufactured item, If your ore is low grade and requires a lot of energy to refine it, that that adds to the cost. Whereas this ore, which is, I forget the number, like 78%, is very, very high in iron. You need to spend almost no energy bringing it to a form that can be used to manufacture things. And as such, it has tremendous value. And it brings tremendous value to the North, but it also has consequences for the environment, for cultural changes in the communities, and so on. But the North as larder is very much a part of what's going on. You know, Antarctica has a treaty. Nobody owns Antarctica. But the North has already been divided up by the 8 countries that border the Arctic. And is it a governable space? Well, that sort of remains to be seen, but I'm really happy that, as partly as a Canadian initiative, but working with colleagues and compadres in the 7 other Arctic circumpolar nations, the Arctic Council was formed about 20 years ago, and that is a multilateral organization to talk about cooperation and building a North that will be good for the North, but also good for the rest of the world, trying to bring all of those different laws and people together. So there are 8 Arctic states, but the Arctic Council also has 6 permanent participants who are the indigenous organizations from around the circumpolar world who are at the table in these discussions. There are working groups with the best scientists available and an increasing number of observers or observer states at the Arctic Council. Now, in its, I happen to be in Nuuk. I've been in Nuuk quite a few times, but on May 12th, 2011, and boy, there was a cast of thousands there. I see Atuk Linga at the end of the line in that sort of blue Borg outfit. Sergei Kiriuchi, who is indigenous leader. He was the head of the Russian Association of Small States. I mean, there's a Leona Glukak right above the Canadian flag. She was our minister at the time, a northerner, and standing beside Kupik Kleist, who was then the president. I don't know, there's Hillary Clinton. She was interested in rare earth minerals, I'm pretty sure. Lisa Murkowski, who has figured in the Donald Trump. Anyway, I'm having a bit of a rundown memory lane. The Arctic Council, for all of its benefits of having those ministers and senior Arctic officials around the table, is a really, really important initiative. It does not have regulatory teeth. They've been talking about all kinds of things and bringing all sorts of scholarship to the fore. They've actually set some resolutions, some of which are legally, well, a couple of which are legally binding, having to do with pollution, search and rescue. But the actual meat and potatoes of what's going to happen with resource extraction and management is something that the Council is thinking about, but it does not have the regulatory teeth to be able to create laws or international arrangements. Maybe it will come in time, but there are people who are not happy that that process is going the way it is, and it could be going more quickly. And one of those people is lives here in Reykjavik. Is Olafur Ragnar Grimsson, the former president of Iceland, who said, you know, it's fine to have the Arctic Council, but we need to have a forum at which anybody can come. Industry, state interests, non-Arctic players like India and China, where we can discuss Arctic issues. And so he created the Arctic Circle. Not single-handedly, but this was his initiative, and everybody met in Reykjavik. And I was at the early meeting of this, and it was incredible. There's Ban Ki-moon from who's head of the UN, you know, saying, "Great job, President Grimsson." Who wasn't there, except in a couple of instances, was the indigenous people. Like at the Arctic Council, there were almost no indigenous people. Josephina Skerk was there, who's an amazing Sami lawyer, and she'd been to the North Pole with Greenpeace and had dropped a petition of, I don't know, thousands and thousands of names to at the North Pole to say that in this impenetrable vessel, to sort of stake the interests of the environment, of the indigenous people, as significant in that process. And actually, at this first meeting of the Arctic Circle, some of Josefina's buddies with Greenpeace, some of them were dressed up as bears outside, but some of the ones who got in had a real contretemps with Arthur Chillingaroff and had to be escorted out, to great cheers from their own, but kind of groans from everybody else. But it was the weirdest. It was like going to a big sale and the farm is being sold, like a big auction, and everything's on the table, but the people who live there were not present. And terms like sustainable exploitation were being thrown around non-ironically, and some of the schemes that were talked about, technically fascinating, but a little scary, a lot scary, relative to the environment, relative to who's doing what, where, and when. And the plans, in some cases, seemed so incredibly well developed that they were almost ready to get going as soon as they had the venture capital money together. There were some contrary voices there. Here's Johan van de Gronden, the CEO of WWF Netherlands, who said this whole thing is a sham. You can't safely mine for oil and gas. I mean, it's an alluring possibility, but we need to build an economy leaving hydrocarbons unburned, and that brought another groan. But the message at the Arctic Circle, and it's evolving. But at that first one, is the North is open for business. It's just a matter of who and when. And I found that disconcerting. But this is where you and I come in. As citizens, I think we have the capability to talk to our politicians, to join NGOs, to get involved in the conversation about what's happening in the North, what's happening in the Arctic, to help shape and support the Arctic Council and the actors who are actually working hard to keep this area to manage the area as a pristine and special and potentially economically important place that it is, but to make it something like other than the Wild West. So, I mean, if we were having this conversation on the ship, it would be an opportunity to have a meal and say more, or to circle up in the bar after an outing and talk about some of these issues. But we can't do that now. Of course, we're into the big COVID time, and this is coming to you, from the back bedroom in Sealy's Bay. But I'm glad to be talking about that. But I want to finish by creating a bit of a musical space for you. Just let these ideas ruminate around. I want to take you to the west coast of Greenland, to probably one of the most beautiful and moving places on Earth, a town called Uummannaq. And contrary to the communities throughout the north, in Nunavut in particular, those 26 communities, 25 of which are on the sea, they're young communities. They're decades old as opposed to centuries old. And I was in Uummannaq. I've been there several times, but I think it was 2013 or maybe 2015. The town was turning 250 years old. And it was a remarkable celebration. Alika Hammond, the Prime Minister, was there, and she's just wandering around. I talked to her in the street, and people were marking this incredible achievement. I mean, the same kind of passages, government riding roughshod over Indigenous concerns, they've happened in Greenland as well, but the Greenlanders have prevailed, and a lot of ways that's encouraging. But 250 years, and we were there and went to this beautiful church, and as part of the celebration they had a choir there, and we had a moving ceremony. Some of it was in English from the local people, a lot of it was in Greenlandic, which are Inuit members of our crew understood very well. But I just want to give you a little taste of the music, because this features in a So to understand where this story goes next, I mean, I left that church that day. I mean, I'm not a churchy kind of person, but I do feel the sanctity of that space and feel the reverence that the people who occupy it, like a lot of churches, exude when they're there. And I left with a feeling of well-being, that this was a celebration. And to sort of take us to where we need to get, so to understand what happened next, I need to explain that Adventure Canada partners with communities, but it also partners with organizations, including Students on Ice, which is an Ottawa-based organization that takes young people to the ends of the earth, and the Arctic expeditions of Students on Ice, which now involve over half of 100 and some students who are Indigenous from around the northern world, well, elsewhere as well, as a chance to learn about international cooperation, to learn about climate change, to learn about each other, to build a network, and so on. But Students on Ice brings scientists and writers and elders and people from the north, people from all over who have an interest in the north, but they also bring artists along the way. And on that trip for the 250th anniversary of Umanak, we had an amazing Métis artist and dancer called Jamie Morse with us. And she's, I had not met her before that, but a really engaging woman who was there, and she'd been doing workshops on dance and cultural studies along the way. Helping people understand what it means to be Métis in the country. But that evening, it was her turn as an artist to do her performance piece, if you like. And she stood up in the Polaris Lounge. Some of you who are watching will have been in that lounge. Some of you will be in it, and I look forward to sharing the space with you. But Jamie stood up in there, and she said, you know, she took us back to the church. She said, that was one of the hardest things I've done in my life. And she teared up and she started saying, I was in that space and all I could think about were the terrible things the church has done to my people. And she said, were it not for the music that happened there, which sort of pulled me out of my funk, I would have run right out the back door. It was awful. And then she said, but it made me think of one of our great leaders, Louis Riel, who said that the Métis people are going to sleep for 100 years, and it's the artists who are going to wake them up. And whoa, I had not heard that before. And at that point, she let the silence of this rapt audience surround her. And she started to dance. And she danced in a way that just brought that energy and electricity of her experience into this performance. And as I watched her, I realized what I was looking at was a very, very different perception of what had gone on that had been completely invisible to me as an informed northern traveler. And that is one of the beauties of the ship. It allows those different opinions to come onto the ship and to be shared and explored in somewhat serendipitous ways. But I was so moved by what I'd seen. The only way I could access that was to actually write about it in a song. And I want to finish today by singing you that song. And to do that, I'm going to have to put these on. Got a children's chorus and a band in the other room. Not. But I'm going to pick up my guitar, and I'd like to play you a song called The Church at Umanak that I think you'll, well, if it has light in it, it's light from Jamie Morse, and it's light that I don't normally see driving down the highway, but since I've seen that light, I'm a different person. Candles light expectant faces, souls here from so many places. Above the cross of Calvary, a ship sails through the sanctuary. Stones cut true and laid with care by fishermen who placed them there. A house of God to build their faith, a refuge in this icy place. And round and round we go, toward the edge to find the flow, dancing to the heartbeat drum while circling the midnight sun. Candlelight makes shadowed places, darkness etched in troubled faces. In the name of Christian fear, stone washed smooth with pagan tears. For some this room holds all that's wrong, misplaced power and word and song. It's time for reconciliation, to reclaim lives that have been taken. Round and round we go, toward the edge to find the flow, dancing to the heartbeat drum while circling the midnight sun.
We all need food, we all need shelter. Music fills our hearts with wonder. Voices raised in harmony. We close our eyes and begin to see. The dancer says to face our fears. The people slept 100 years. And now the artists ring the bell to break the church's holy spell.
Candles light 1,000 places, heroes with 1,000 faces. We trace the trails of mystery with lines etched on a northern sea. We're seeking truth in all its forms, challenging accepted norms. We sail through ice beyond the known while searching for a route back home. Round and round and round we go, toward the edge to find the flow, dancing to the heartbeat drum while circling the midnight sun. And round and round we go, toward the edge to find the flow, dancing to the heartbeat drum while circling the midnight sun. Oh, so there we are, the church at Umanak. Jamie hasn't been back with Students on Ice, sadly, but her daughter Riley Mackenzie has, who was definitely a chip off the old block. Riley was with us last year and danced the dance of her mum, and it was truly amazing as well. What a pleasure to see her and to meet her, and also to sing her the church at Umanak and tell her how her mum had moved me and many, many other people. Just to wind up, I love this image. I think it's from a Northwest Territorial Air poster back in the day. I first saw, though, an upside-down map of Canada that intrigued me in a book called Playing Dead, A Contemplation on the Arctic by Rudy Wiebe that I would highly recommend. It actually opens with an upside-down map of the North. And I hope that we cross paths on a out of the Northwest Passage trip or an into, or that you meet some of my amazing colleagues who are wonderful singers and songwriters and scientists and elders and storytellers and hosts, all handpicked by Jason and Cedar and the team at Adventure Canada. I look forward to that when we go, but I do want to say that it's been a pleasure walking you through this idea of North. If we bounced around a little bit, it really is just a discussion generator. I hope you'll go to the Arctic Council website and have a look at that and perhaps read on as well. That's it for episode 3. Episode 4 is coming. It's called You Done Stomped on My Heart, and other stories from the high seas, and it's a little lighter touch on the sort of the Adventure Canada way on the ship in the north and the other places it goes. It's going to be fun, but that's coming up. But as always, if you have questions, please send them along. If you want to be involved in this episode's promotion for an Adventure Canada voucher, by all means, do that. And if you want to get in touch, I'm Raffan at Instagram and on the website, and that's where you can find my email as well, or on Facebook. But thank you for joining us for episode 3. Hope you're doing okay in your COVID time. Tally ho! Cheers. Bye for now.